Eben Kirksey is an anthropologist I work with some and really enjoy as a thinker. And I answered this to a question of his or something similar. And he said, don't humans give you that? Um, and I think the answer was not in that same way, right? Like, not in that same sort of just dumbfounding look into the grandeur of the living world. Humans give me other things, but there's something special about what other species can trigger.
Why Knowledge Matters. Welcome, I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, Rob Dunn. Rob Dunn is a Reynolds Professor in the Department of Applied Ecology and Senior Vice Provost for University Interdisciplinary Programs at North Carolina State University. He is also the author of this beautiful book, A Natural History of the Future. The New York Times called it an arresting vision of the relentless natural world. I'm so pleased to have you on the show, Professor Rob Dunn.
Yannick, it's such a pleasure to be on the show. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for those kind words.
It's beautiful. I really relished your book, even though it's also to some extent technical, but also it is accessible for, as myself, like the general reader. And I truly appreciate the balance, the science behind it, and also that you took to some extent also a hopeful approach for us and especially our future, our children, when it comes to the challenges that truly lay ahead. So, therefore, I'm really pleased to discuss the book. But first and foremost, who is Rob Dunn in just one sentence?
In just one sentence, I'm an ecologist who thinks interdisciplinarily about the world that includes humans, but also millions, maybe trillions of other species.
Beautiful. What was some of the indication that you embarked on the journey to become an outstanding scientist, in the past? Give us an example, an excerpt of your childhood that really showed, yes, Rob Dunn is meant what he's doing now. A brilliant scientist.
Um, that's an interesting question. So when I was a kid, I grew up, mostly outside. I grew up in nature. I grew up catching snakes and turtles and fish and housing them. Uh, but when I was a kid, I didn't know there was any career that corresponded to that. And so when I went to college, I thought I'd be an economist. And so I got to college. I started off with all my, Econ 101, macro and micro. And then I discovered these people in another building, the biology building, and they had nets, they had cages, they had dirty boots, and I didn't know what species they were, but I knew like somehow they were in relation to me. And what I would eventually discover is it was actually at the interface of those two things. Economists think uh, very synthetically about what are the general rules of systems, and ecologists do that too. And so for me, ecology was a way to blend my interest in what I'd call natural history and the workings of individual organisms, their lives, their details, but also with the quest for thinking about, even when we don't know all the details, what general things do we know to be true? And so that was part of my road, and then the road shifted. I started off as a tropical ecologist. I still really like tropical ecology, tropical ecosystems. But when I landed at North Carolina State University, I was in a department full of people who could make more fish, they could make more wheat, they could fundamentally alter people's lives. And I really had this feeling that what I was doing was quite obscure relative to that uh, daily offering that my colleagues were giving to people. And so eventually that led me to work more and more in the sort of daily lives of humans, to think about, well, what do these things I know from tropical ecosystems have to do with your backyard, with your food, with what's happening in your bedroom? And so I started to bring that into the daily world. And I think my successes where I've had them have been in linking that sort of fundamental big picture understanding of how the living world works with the recognition that even if we're living in an apartment in the 20th floor in New York City, that we're still part of an ecological world. Um, and so I'm still doing that same thing I did as a kid, except now I get paid for it and I get to do it with other people with different knowledge and different interests. So it's a good gig.
Yeah, it's beautiful, and it's truly, I can feel your passion about what you're doing, and by doing so, you're truly being a gift, as you just showed, with your book that you published, but also to all the world. It's really infectious. And so I can't imagine that what you're doing is truly your purpose and what you really gives you life.
It does, and it's. I mean, I think the other, just the practical advantage of having different dimensions to my career is on any given day, I struggle with one or another of them. As a writer, there are bad days. And so if I'm having a bad day as a writer, well, I'm a scientist. As a scientist, there are bad days. But if I'm having a bad day as a scientist, I'm an administrator or a leader. And so being able to do these different things helps me, even in a world that's full of trauma and hard realities, to stay centered on these things I know I want to do and to have some part of them that always is bringing me joy. But I will say, being with other organisms that I can learn from and writing, those are just, uh, I mean, almost invariably centering things that make me more of myself or my better self. Um, and so I have the good fortune to have discovered both of those things early in my career.
It almost sounds like a yoga class that really calms you down by just contemplating the natural world and the wonder. It's incredible, just because that's also what I find so interesting is, of course, you're a scientist. It's also extremely abstract, but at the same time you also truly live through it, with your interior world, but then also, and then how you perceive it, and then you digest it in some way that kind of is this back and forth, which is really interesting.
I always liked the Japanese poet Kobayashi Isa in that context. And so Isa was a quirky haiku poet, but he wrote a lot about the species that lived around him. I think one of them is something like uh, horse peeing near my pillow. And so it suggests this weird intimacy that we often have with other species. But another one is don't worry, spiders. I keep house casually. And I think a lot of what we're doing as biologists too is confronting these relationships and how do we negotiate them when they're on the one hand so everyday and on the other hand so unusual and other. And I like that space. We're all in it, whether or not we acknowledge it.
Yeah, it's beautiful, but I can really tell. It's almost like what Gert said, right? That you discover like the known in the unknown, and the
Mhm.
unknown the known, right? Somehow. So beautiful. Now, what made you write the book in the first place? Where was there a moment where you decided, hey, you know what? I gotta put this into a book. And I can't imagine like the work it took you to piece all these pieces together into a really beautifully written book. It's not just, the science, but it's also like the stories that you're telling. So bringing all this together, wow. When was the moment that you realized, okay, I want to do it? And then walk us a little bit through how it also felt when you actually started. And did you had like this epiphany then, wow, it's one thing having conceptually the idea of writing a book, but it's a whole other game to actually write it.
So, what if I'm being honest? One piece of the book comes out of a kind of love and frustration for my colleagues, in the sense that when you're working with other ecologists, you can imagine that the whole world is filled with other ecologists that are thousands of us, and like that's the normal way of being. Um, and so it's easy to forget that other people don't think like ecologists, or that many people don't think like ecologists. And so the more as my career has expanded into other disciplines, the more aware I've become. The more I've expanded in other disciplines, the more aware I've become that the ecologist, evolutionary biologist perspective is relatively unique, but also that it's relatively rare, that it's not part of how we make decisions most of the time. And so that a lot of what ecologists take for granted about how the living world works, we've forgotten to ever tell anybody about. And so it's like an accidental secret. Like, and so part of this book comes out of that feeling that what we know about the living world has bearing on all of these decisions we're making, and yet we don't have a very loud voice in those decisions, and so we need to find a better way to speak to more people. And then the other piece, because the book is really, it launches from the present and our understanding of the past into the future or the futures. And the other thing I became sort of iteratively aware of in thinking about the book is that as scientists, most scientists are not super comfortable in thinking about the future. Or if we do, we think it's somebody else's job. And so I started to toy with these interviews with ecologists, evolutionary biologists, like, what do you think about the future of your field? And again, I found people saying, well, I may be the world's expert on bees, but why would I know about the future of bees? And it was really frustrating because if you, as the world expert in bees, don't know about the future of bees, who do you think does know about the future of bees? You're the only, if somebody's going to reach out, it's you. Um, and so these two pieces sort of came together. Like, how do I take what ecologists know about the world as it works and will continue to work and share that? And how do I use that understanding to help think about what the future can be like? And then the other thing that starts to come in is at the time I was writing this book, and for me, a book is very iterative. I talked to Carl Zimmer, the science writer, about writing books at one point, and Carl makes a plan, and then he writes the book like he's planned it. The chapters in the proposal are the chapters in the book. For me, a book is way more like a kind of clay that as I write, like I'm working that clay, I'm reworking that clay. I have an idea of the structure, but the clay is also asserting itself. And when I was writing this book, one of the things that started to assert itself was this idea of thinking about multiple scenarios and lived scenario. And so how do we build into our way of thinking about the future the idea that there are these different possible futures, and we don't know which one will be on, but we get choices between which one we work toward. And so in a way, that's coming from speculative fiction writers. I happen to be talking to one speculative fiction writer a lot while writing the book, and his approach of thinking about, well, why couldn't the world be like that, was a useful challenge that kept working back into that clay. And so for me, like, those were key pieces. And then I had to think of, well, what are the things we most know already about the world of the future? Because we just know that this is how the living world works. And then those were those elements that worked back in. And then this is a long answer to this pithy question, Yannick, but I'll close here, which is to say that, I started thinking about, well, here, what are these 10 rules or these 10 laws? And then as I unpacked it, each of those had these other layers to them. And, that's part of the fun part of writing the book, of shaping this organic thing that goes out to live away from me in its own separate life. And so, yeah, that for me is a great joy of tangling with that clay.
You really decipher and take it apart what the nature and its laws, you know, how it best predicts to somehow our future. And please tell and elaborate on that, how the nature and its laws really is a way of, to some extent, predicting the future, and especially our future as a species.
Yeah, I'll give you two examples. One's the law of corridors, and one's the law of natural selection or evolution. And so, the law of corridors is something that ecologists and conservation biologists have worked on for a while in order to understand how to connect conservation landscapes as species migrate with climate change. And so they know that if you create a bigger corridor for species that are more likely to be able to move with climate change, you're more likely to get a mountain lion moving north, or uh, uh, a forest dependent owl if you've got a good corridor of habitat. And so that's a law-like feature of the living world. And most species on Earth are going to have to move as climate changes. But one of the fun things with the book is I could then also consider what are the other implications of that law. And one of the ones that seem to have gone unnoticed is that, yes, it's true if you make more forest as a corridor, that forest species will move. But it's also true if you make more of some other habitat, that those species will move. And so if you look at Eastern North America, for example, what kinds of corridors have we made? Well, we've made a giant city that stretches almost from Atlanta to Boston with a couple of gaps. And it's a perfect corridor. It's just a corridor for species we don't like. And so here I'm taking this law-like feature of the living world, that if you connect habitat, species can move through them, and then connecting it with an awareness of what we've actually done, not what we hope we might do. And so that's one of the laws I tangle with in the book. And it's an example of what's obvious to ecologists, but not necessarily to a broader discussion. And then if you had a beer with an ecologist and you said, well, if you created a giant city from Atlanta to Boston, would all the city species be able to move north more quickly than any other species? And would we inadvertently favor species we don't like? They would all say, of course, that's the most obvious thing given what we know about corridors. I'm not going to write a paper about it because it's so obvious. Why do you even need to tell me? But in fact, it's not obvious if you don't think about corridors every morning. The same is true of natural selection. That when we went through the pandemic, one of the things you saw on lots of products was this kills 99.9% of germs. And I think in general we think of that as a good thing. But what the law of natural selection tells us is that that's exactly the wrong percent to kill. Because the other way to say that is favors point, one, point zero, whatever the remainder of, favors that. The other way to say that is that this favors a small percent of germs that it doesn't kill. And what we know from natural selection is that those will be germs that have evolved resistance to whatever it is you're spraying. And this seems like a little banal piece of the story, but you scale that up, and we predictably see the consequences of the overuse of antibiotics, of the overuse of pesticides, of the overuse of herbicides. And we know that that favors the evolution of new lineages and new species. That's defining feature is we can't kill them. And so there are a lot of these law-like features of the living world, of ecology and evolution, that bear upon our lives all the time, but we don't think about it in that way. And then they rear up in these moments. Probably most of your viewers or listeners know somebody who's had a resistant staph infection, MRSA. Well, that's a direct consequence of kills 99.9% of germs. And it's a direct consequence we can feel, we know in our families, it affects us directly. And yet it seems esoteric. And so that's often what I'm trying to do, is to take this seemingly esoteric feature of the living world and how it works and bring it into your living room, bring it into your family, so that we can have conversations about it together. Because there's no way that ecologists on our own can make the kinds of changes we need to make. We're a small, weird group, right? These are policy decisions. They're individual consumer decisions. they're everybody decisions. And we might not decide the way that most people want to decide. And so they're also the case that, my job is to lift up the understanding so that we can have the discussion, because the world I want might not be the mean world we collectively want. I hope it is, but might not be.
It is so true, and that's why it also opened me so much up to how I consider also where I live. There is, for example, in North America, here in northern Quebec, there's, for example, because of the roads now are built for, mining and people living here more and more, that, for example, too, these are also somehow like corridors, for example, for the wolves. Now they are able to travel much, much further, and that's why also they obviously they catch, more quickly, prey and so on, right? So that is so interesting, and you brought this in such a beautiful way into light for everyone, right? That we can have those discussion. On the other hand too, it's so interesting when you think, and that's why I like your book so much, is that whatever we build, even if we build like a new whatever, like houses, in the park and so on, of course it has a negative influence on the ecology overall, of course, but also, as you just said, it also built other corridors. Now the problem is that, as you mentioned, there's a lot of those animals, those species that we don't necessarily want, right? And that's the huge problem. So how do you think we can kind of start having a different approach, that we actually to somehow anticipate what you're saying, but also to cultivate, ecology that helps the species that we actually want and want to strive, including ourselves, you know, in the future?
So, so I think there are a bunch of answers. What in the resistance context, what some people have begun to talk about is that susceptibility, the ability to be killed, is a kind of resource in those species we manage. And there are ways to manage, for example, pathogens to keep them susceptible. If we take care with our antibiotic use, we can keep them susceptible so that even if we're not eradicating them fully, when they're around, we can get rid of them. And so changing what we think of as the goal sometimes is helpful. I'll also say that in my last book, I took a poke at architects. I was talking about the living world in houses, and architects really responded, to their credit, positively. You know, Quite a few architects reached out and said, "Look, I'm willing to make houses that are much more hospitable to more species that would benefit us. How do we work on it?" And so I think, there's a version of that here, which is that urban planners, developers, a lot of people we wouldn't think about as natural allies, I think many of them are really open to having new conversations about how do we create these worlds with these law-like features in mind. And so I find that really very hopeful that there are these people willing to make bold change. And so I think the other element of this is, how do we stage those conversations? And Yannick, your forum here is a great example, so that we can start to talk together about, there's a national policy issue version of this. But I think what's more proximate to most of us is, how do we have these conversations in our own places? And so how do we create fora in which we can start to talk these through? Um, Yeah, and that question had lots of dimensions, but that's an answer to one of those dimensions, I think.
Yeah, I think you make a very good point, because oftentimes it's just, breaking out of the silos, right? And just, ultimately find these common denominators that really holds us together. And I think there is no way that people would, you know, be very resistant, if they had a forum, or if they have access, to people like you, who actually understand and explain in a more tangible manner, the complexity that we face, but also that there are solutions, to the problem. And that's also, I find it's always so important that on the one hand, you have the challenges, antibiotics you mentioned beautifully in the book, but on the other hand, it always leads us to find new ways to really solve problems, because that's what really science is. It's really here to solve problems, but it's obviously not as easy. But also, again, what I that's why I find this book is so important, because you point out the road and that there is hope, and it's not easy, but there are clearly solutions, despite the fact that at times it seems almost like we are in the last like couple of 100 years of our species. And I think that's also not very helpful to see it in that way.
Yeah, the other thing I would say, Yannick, in response to that is that what I found a little bit while writing the book and then also afterwards is that some of the greatest allies in thinking about better futures are artists. It's often very hard to imagine a world different than the one that's around us. And, visual artists, performance artists, writers, uh, I think can really help us to see what else could we create. And children are the other people that are just amazing at being able to say, this can be different. How would we like it to be different? And I think, as scientists, we've often failed in that regard, that we're not trained to create entirely new worlds. And so we need this interchange with artists who can help us. And my example of this that I always come back to is, if we think about climate change, we often return to these different climate scenarios, and there are different versions. But they're really scenarios about consequences. If you have this much emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, how much warming do you get? Well, if I'm if I'm living in Toronto, say, and I'm thinking about my daily life, that could not be more abstract from my daily life. It's not a scenario. It's not a scenario for how I live. It's a scenario about an abstraction. And so those climate scenarios have been proven really difficult to use to help people make change, because how do you relate to, these abstract mean annual temperature goals, or these abstract emissions goals? What does that mean for me on Tuesday? And I think the alternative would have been, if we go back in time, is to think not about those abstractions, but what are different worlds we can create, and what features would those different worlds have. But if to do that, going back in time, we would have had to have the fiction writers and the physicists work together, and there aren't a lot of parties where they meet, and so I think that's that other thing, is how can we be more ambitious about that coming together. And I mean, that's part of my other job here, is to think at North Carolina State University, how do I get the physicists and the artists at dinner together? How do I get the speculative fiction writers and the evolutionary biologists together? And sometimes it works and it's great, and then sometimes it's terrible. But I think collectively trying more of that would benefit us.
I think we are truly on our way. I think that's just so there are more and more those interdisciplinary departments and so on, whether in university or in other places in the world. How were you able to balance this book so nicely? On one hand, you're very factual, also to some extent dark, but also at the same time it's hopeful and really balanced, the book.
So, um, I mean, I'll share the ending, right? Which is the part of the ending that thinks about the world after us, like what can we know? Um, and part of my goal in sharing that is to say, what we're facing is not the end of nature, that nature is this much bigger thing than us. Living nature is this much bigger thing than us, that nothing we've ever done has threatened the unfolding of life's evolution and blossoming. And to me, that's really hopeful. And it sounds like to you, Yannick, but there certainly are other readers to whom that doesn't feel hopeful. And so it's interesting because I was trying to land somewhere in the space of hope and the idea that, yes, we're in some hard times now, but also this bigger history of life is so much bigger. Um, that to me, that there's a sublimity to that. It's like looking out at the stars, looking out at the full duration of the life's experiment. We're so small, and in that, I experience a lot of hope. But it's clear, like hearing, listening to readers, that not everybody does, and so I, this is a question rather than an answer. But I think the question of the extent to which people find hope in life story versus exclusively in the human story is interesting to me. Um, and is that is there something religious there about how we think about humans and human specialness? Is it just the fact that we're humans and we can only look at ourselves? We center ourselves and we have to. Um, I earnestly don't know, but I'm very intrigued by it, and I love that, Yannick, you felt it as hopeful because I feel it as hopeful, but certainly that's not universal, and so then thinking about if people see this same story in so many different ways, what does that mean about how we might have our conversations,
Yeah,
and
that's
what
also.
our long term goals are, right? Like, is our goal to save humans at all costs? I'm not so I don't want anybody on Earth to suffer, but the idea that our species goes on forever, I'm not so wed to, um, and I'm very comfortable with that. But at the same time, I sense that when I say that, there's some alarm there, which is interesting.
It's also interesting because obviously as a scientist, on the one hand, you you're very abstract and very pragmatic, but also on the other hand, you find solutions, right? And so to find somehow a balance is of course it has the many variables come into play. But I think when I look at especially the science, especially the past 100 years or so, then there is just I don't find any rationale to not be hopeful. When I look at the just the trajectory in terms of humanity in general, it's very very short, of course. But when we look at the progress, and of course we can always look at it negative point of view, but if you actually look at the empirical facts, how we have improved. Of course, with every improvement comes also to some extent inclination, an incline for some in one way or another. So it's really hard, and of course it has to do also with a lot of mindset. But I am grateful that there are still so many people out there, such as yourself, that try to find a balanced, factual, assessment of our situation. Because it's I think our children, we owe it to our children especially to have somehow a vision for improvement, rather than that it is the end of the world.
Yeah, and I think, my observation too is what's possible scientifically today compared to when I was a grad student, which is a while ago, but not so long ago, is almost to the point of witchcraft. Uh, It's unbelievable. And we still live in a world where most species are not yet named. And so, were I a scientist just getting started today, what is possible with just discovery has never been a more vast. Some of this returns to Goethe, but of a vaster unknown. Um, and at the same time, what's possible in terms of solutions? There are solutions today that were inconceivable 5 years ago. And you know those have to be buffered by what we want. What kind of solution do we want? What are our goals for those solutions? And yet the possible is so vast right now, that it's really quite humbling.
How did the process of writing this book change you, if at all, on a personal level?
Um, yeah, that's a good question. So I think, I mean, some of the sentiments in the book have been floating in my head for a while. Like, a book's not a short project. You know, some part of this book is 10 years old, you know, that's I've been tangling with. And so maybe the fullest answer to your question is it's changed me over 10 years as I've thought about it. As I think about the gravity of our moment, at the same time, the hope of that's possible. And so one version of the answer to that part of the question would be, for example, you know, I know from some of the climate niche work that the Sahel is really in trouble as a climate space and a place for people to live and eat and thrive. And so I think about that every day, every in some point every day. And then as we do science on our campus, how do we make sure that we're taking the gravity of the moment seriously enough? And so I think it's changed me a little bit in that way over that longer time period. The, the other is, as the book has gone on and as I've talked about it more, I've become even more committed to the value of bringing these different perspectives together. Um, and so in the way, the book is me speaking from the perspective of my fields, but in relation to these other conversations and fields. Um, and, and I've seen the power more with, in my experience with books. There's the how you change while you're writing them, and then there's how you change once you start having to talk about them. And there's sort of two different phases, because in that second phase, you see how a broader audience is responding to this story that you're telling. And in general, for me, it's that second phase that changes me personally more, because I also then see where I'm weird, or where the perspective I thought was the obvious perspective wasn't, or, you know, where I wasn't seeing something fully. And and so with this book, part of that has really been that embrace of the arts, that embrace of some of these other disciplines that can help me to see and that can really help us to make change. So I think it's changed me in that way. And then maybe the other piece, and I don't know how much this is the book or the conversations that started with the book that spilled over, is really trying to get better at listening to people. You know, what kind of stories are useful to you? If you live on the coast of North Carolina and your house is going to flood, um, what do you want to know about the future? Uh, and how do we address some of the questions that I'm addressing in the book, but in this more pragmatic local level? You know, we can tell you all the obscure things you want to know about the future, but what's the stuff you need in order to make the decision you're going to have to make? Um, and so I'm still thinking a lot about what that looks like in practice, but it's something that um, has become more centered in my work life.
Yeah, it's beautiful, and you illustrate this so beautifully because there is this irreducibility of complexity, right? Biology is just, we cannot really pin it down, right? And so is the ecosystem so complex and interrelated, but so is the social ecosystem in this
Yeah.
sense, right? And bringing those together, it takes time, obviously. And I think overall, I think we did a lot of progress, and thankfully to people like you who are able to illustrate us to, you know, a general audience, you know, such as myself. It's just beautiful. What was the biggest challenge in writing the book that you faced?
Um, yeah, these are great questions, Yannick. So I think it's a kind of book where there are infinite stories I could have told, right? And so trying to think about what are these general things we know about the living world that are the most important to tell. Um, I think that's a hard part. You know, there's always a part in book writing for me where I have to delete my favorite chapters. You go on and accreting these chapters that are the thing you want to read, but I'm not my reader. Like I'm definitely not who I want to read the book. And so there's so that's a hard part. And I'm working on a new book right now, and I just had to go and delete one of my favorite chapters. And I knew I was going to do it, but I can't avoid writing. I was like, oh, here's what Rob really wants to read. Let me write it for him, which is a weird thing to say, but so that's a hard part. I mean, there's one chapter I've now written in like versions of it in 4 books, and I always delete it because I know it's just like too sweet a version of the story. So that's always a hard part. And then it's always hard to know where you're landing relative to a reader that you don't know. That's always and the writer always gets that wrong, right? Like there's no way to get it wrong because you never know the full scope of your readers. And so that's always a trick. And like early in my career, I've had the same editor now for a while, and one of his assistants was reading one of my books, and I'd written something to the effect of that something looked like a fish gill. I don't remember what it was. I said looked like a fish gill. And the assistant editor said, why would anyone know what a fish gill looks like? And to me as a biologist, it's like, oh my God, how do you not know what a fish gill looks like? Have you never seen it? Like, have you never held a fish, looked at a fish in a market? But that assistant editor was right. She was a better representative of a reader than I was going to be. And so I was wrong. Like my perspective that you should just know what a fish gill looks like. And so I think that's always a hard part in a book, is you're always doing a little bit of that. Like, is this a fish gill? Like, is this something people will know? Or that I can convince you that you might want to know enough about that I can explain it? Or am I using as my reference point something that's sufficiently obscure that you have to look up the comparator that I'm trying to use to be? And so that's always hard.
Coffee or tea? Coffee or tea? Coffee or tea?
Oh, coffee or tea? Sorry, there was some background noise here, Yannick. Coffee.
Okay. How does a morning look like, at Professor Rob Dunn's place?
Right now, I get up early. I write for a little bit.
What does mean early? What do you mean by early?
Right now, I get up around. Today, I get up. I'll tell you today. Today, I get up at 5:30. I wrote till about 6:15. My son got up, checked in on him. He's 14. He mostly does his own thing. He grumbled at me. He got out the door at 6:50, and then I went to got ready to come in and to work. And in that point, after he grumbled at me, but before he walked out the door, I had a coffee. I had a little bit of tofu and a paratha, like a savory breakfast. And so that was my morning. But I prefer to write at night, but I'm a much better writer in the morning. And so if I'm honest to my writerly self, I get up early, but I don't really like it. But it's when my head is just clear and I can just be in the words.
How do you feel when you get up in the morning? And in an ordinary day, how do you feel? And do you have a hard time to disconnect from work?
Not in the morning. In the morning, if I go and I've got my coffee and I've maybe got music on, but not like a podcast or something, I can just be present. At 10 p.m. or something, it's harder, and maybe that's my difficulty now of writing in the evening. By that point, my brain is full of, some grumpy faculty member, some decision I've got to make, a donor conversation. Somebody just told me they're not in favor of sustainability. Like all that stuff's in my head, and I can't write myself out of that mess. But in the morning, if it's going well, the head's clean. And so I can sit down and like today I was writing about how humans and dogs communicate via olfaction. and I could be just in that.
Beautiful, beautiful. What activity describes you best besides an academic?
Um, well, I mean, the pretentious answer would be, I think, on some level, like an artist. Um, I appreciate the pretentiousness of that answer, but the thinking about creating beautiful things, right? Like that's a part of what I do on a good day as a scientist. It's what I think about as a writer. Beautiful, lasting things. And I just really like ideas. Like the idea that, I mean, you mentioned Goethe earlier. Like there was a time when Goethe and Humboldt were hanging out in Jena in Germany. Um, the idea of sitting with people and talking about ideas and that might be able to change something about the world, that's the good stuff.
Beautiful. What makes you happy?
Um, I mean, really happy. Like my kids doing cool things. Being with friends and family, being with people that I'm relaxed enough to really let my guard down and talk earnestly about the strange, strange world. Um, yeah, that brings me joy. Humans are strange, but they're also often the best thing we got.
Beautiful. Your single best advice to really forge a better natural history of the future, a practical advice, what I can do immediately, or our listeners.
So, I think my single best advice. Yeah, I can pause on this one for 1 second, Yannick. So I think if your listeners and if you recognize that any space that you manage or own is full of living beings. The space you're in right now, Yannick, if you've got a yard, your front yard, if you've got a communal community space, that space, and every day you make choices about which species to have there and to not have there. And you never get to choose to make something sterile. Nothing in our daily lives is sterile. And so you're always choosing which species. And so I think starting with this question, which species do I think starting with this question, which species do I want to live with? And then how do I make the changes in my immediate life to favor those species? And just as a for example, there's outside my office, someone's put up uh, a solitary bee hotel. And it is full of these beautiful solitary bees right now. I mean, there are hundreds of them. And on top of that is an anolis lizard that sits there and gets fat eating the bees. And it's beautiful. It's this beautiful thing I can go see. It's also connected to the flowers that are right next door. It's an ugly actual structure, right? Like we need the design people in. But clearly that's part of a world I'd like to make more of. And so what are those things in your own life that are part of the living world you would like to see more of? And my answer won't be exactly the same as yours, but I think if we're all working toward that, almost none of us would choose to make the world we most often make, which is a world full of resistant organisms with the potential to harm us. And so that's where I would start.
Beautiful answer. You can't answer this actually better and more concise as you just did. Wow. Single best advice for living a purposeful, meaningful, and fulfilled life.
And part of the answer to I'm hesitant with advice for living a fulfilled life because I'm aware that that is a culture bound thing, and that a fulfilling life looks different in different places. But I'll say, given my perspective, that finding ways to be around other species and with humans who are part of a community that you want to build, Like those two things are pretty core to a fulfilling life for me. Um, yeah, but I don't pretend to be able to answer that question in a way that's gonna work in Kenya and Japan and Kazakhstan. Um, but yeah, that's what it is for me.
Lastly, what makes you truly feel alive?
Um, in the natural world, happening upon something I didn't expect but can contextualize. You know, finding a raccoon with its butt stuck in a hole in a tree, right? Like trying to get into the tree. Driving along and seeing a barred owl swoop right next to the car. Uh, Seeing a black rat snake curled in a tree and not being able to tell, is that one rat snake or is it two? And that moment of seeing some amazing living organism that I couldn't have predicted would be right there, and that almost certainly holds some mystery I don't understand. Like that will stop me and bring me awe and joy. Even talking about it brings me joy. And so for me, that's the best stuff. Um, and I'll say that Eben Kirksey is an anthropologist I work with some and really enjoy as a thinker. And I answered this to a question of his or something similar. And he said, you know, don't humans give you that? Um, and I think the answer was not in that same way, right? Like not in that same sort of just dumbfounding look into the grandeur of the living world. Humans give me other things, but there's something special about what other species can trigger for me.
Professor Rob Dunn, thank you so much for your time, for being a blessing and gift to me and truly to the world.
Yannick, thank you for talking with me. It's been a pleasure and to think out loud with you. And this is the good stuff. So I really appreciate it.
Professor Rob Dunn. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com.